What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This episode number 568. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line all the way from Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, how was your qualification weekend?
Oh, it was great. This is the first of 7 league play weekends for MPL and Rivals, and I went 9-3. You know, the Rogues deck did not let me down. I Shark Typhooned a lot of people.
You sure did.
Yeah, I'm tied for first now. There's, I think, like 3 other people at 9 wins alongside me. So I'm, of course, very happy with that start.
Yeah, fantastic work. I remember on the show last week, you said that you really liked where the deck that you guys had worked on was positioned and that you thought you had made good choices. Because remember, you got to see who you were playing and the matchups and all that stuff. And you were particularly excited about your Yorion matchup. That went pretty well.
Yeah, I 6-0'd Yorions in the tournament. And so, yeah, I think that our deck ended up being a solid choice for the weekend, and it ended up being the best for me just because I played against 6 Yorion decks. But that's kind of what we were hoping to do. Mm-hmm. We didn't think that we were going to play against half Yorion, but hey, I'll take it.
Yeah, so nice work, and we'll continue to follow your progress as we work our way through those weekends. There's another one coming up in a month, or in a few weeks, I guess, for next month. So there you go. So on the show this week, listener questions. That's right. Our patrons have submitted questions for our Q&A episode here for kind of the Zendikar Rising set here, although the questions can be about anything, and I love these shows. These have become one of the shows I look forward to the most that we do because the questions from our patrons are absolutely fantastic, and this show is no exception, I will say that. Before we get into the questions, a few things to take care of. First thing, our sponsor. That's channelfireball.com. Make sure you head over to Channel Fireball for anything you need. Magical. Any you need supplies, you need singles, you need sealed product, you can go over to channelfireball.com and they'll have it for you there. They have fair pricing as well as great customer service over there, so you can feel safe and secure that you're going to get your order and they're going to stand by their product over at Channel Fireball. On top of it, there's a whole lot more going on. There's CFB Pro. That's the premium content side of the website. If you want to get that, you can pay $10 a month, but then you'll get $10 in store credit back, or $5 a month if you just don't want to mess around with the store credit thing. And you get access to really top tier, well thought out, in-depth content from some of the best content creators around. And if that's not in the cards for you, that's okay too. There's still free content over there. I had another draft video go up this week. Minor spoiler alert here, Luis. I can't believe it. Luis, our work is never, ever, ever, ever done. No matter what, if we think
what card did someone play against you?
So, no, guess what wheeled?
Roost of Drakes.
So I passed this card, which was already a huge, what is going on here? Royal Eruption wheeled.
Royal Eruption? That's not even one of those cards where maybe no one's in the Clerics deck, so the Relic Vial wheels. No, Royal Eruption, any deck that has mountains in it really wants it. And even some decks that don't, like blue-green decks, often splash for it.
Exactly. So I took it when it wheeled and moved in and ended up not even playing my first pick, of course. But anyway, those videos are up over at CFB on their YouTube channel, and those are, free to access and all of that stuff. So if you do buy anything or sign up for CFB Pro or anything, please use the affiliate code LR. It lets them know that we sent you over and help support the show. So thank you for doing that. Of course, if you want to support the show directly, Patreon's the place to do it. Patreon.com/limited resources for all the information there. And the thing I'll focus on here is that you get access to the Patreon feed. This is where we can interact with our most dedicated listeners, including asking them questions about things for the show, directions we want to go. Would this be a good idea? Would this not? But important for this episode, the questions. You get to actually submit the questions that we answer here on the air in that feed. Now, the good news for us is that we have so many awesome listeners in there that we rarely can answer all the questions. So that's good news and bad news. We would prefer to answer every single question if we could, but it also means that we get so many great questions every time that we never run out and can keep these cool Q&A shows going as well. So patreon.com/limited resources for that. Let's do a crack a pack real quick here, Luis, before we jump into our questions. Let's see. Our first, this didn't turn out very well. All right. Well, I can still see what they are, I think. I got apparently a lower resolution downloaded version here, but here it is. Our first card out is Sure-Footed Infiltrator. Is that what it's called?
Well, the 2/3 that draws a card when it hits them. So we're starting with an uncommon, I guess.
Yeah, wait, why is that? Oh, it's a foil. It's a foil.
Oh, well, I think Sure-Footed Infiltrator is fine. I'm actually a little lower on it than I was when I first saw the card.
Same.
It's not a bad card by any means, but it's a 4-mana 2/3. There's a lot of good removal that hits it. We're talking Royal Eruption, Nahiri's Binding, Vanquish the Weak, Feed the Pack, Deadly Alliance. Or Feed the Swarm, rather. There's just so much. And you also need to be in rogues for it to be good. In a black-white, or a blue-white deck or a blue-red deck, it's just not really going to perform. It's not great in blue-green. So I'm not unhappy picking this card if I'm in rogues, but I generally will not want to start a draft with it. I think I would take probably like a Stonework Pack Beast over it. Pick one, pack one, for example. Okay,
yeah, I'm not quite that low on it, but I have definitely jumped down a bunch on it as well. The scenario that I imagined was that you would be able to start to get in with some early rogues and kind of put your opponent a little bit on the defensive, and then when they did put their defenses up, then your Sure-Footed Infiltrator would be able to get in there and generate a big advantage. And it hasn't really quite played out like that as you described. Next card, our first common, as it turns out, is Rabid Bite. It's a good card.
Rabid Bite's solid. It's not a card that I'm over the moon about, but it's a solid card.
Yeah.
There's the
much
fact
better
that
cards
Colony Ambush is one of the solid uncommons for green means I don't end up lacking fight effects all that much. I'm not saying you always get a Colony Ambush, but it's the sort of thing where I'd much rather have that one, and Rabid Bite's just not that high priority for me.
You would rather have Colony Ambush because of the land factor?
Yeah, the land factor makes it so much better.
Yeah, I mean, this is a bite versus a fight, but it's also sorcery versus instant. It definitely kind of pits the two types of cards against each other. Next is Turn Timber Ascetic. That's the 5/4 for 4 and a green and gains 3 life when it ETBs. No, I mean, you can put it in your deck and it's not embarrassing, but obviously it's not even close to what we're looking at for first picking. Marauding Blight Priest, 2 and a black, 3/2. Whenever you gain a life, each opponent loses a life. Big performer in the Clerics deck, not so much anywhere else. I mean, you could put it in Red-Black Party if you need Clerics because it is, it does fill that role.
I think I'm on Sure-Footed Infiltrator so far.
Yeah, I think I am too. Kibera Outrider is next. That's the 3 and a white, 3/3. Warrior, when it ETBs, another creature gets +1/+1 for each creature in your party. Again, a fine card in a white aggressive deck. Those decks aren't showcased in this format, though you can draft them. They do exist. It's not like they're not there. And this is a card you can play in there. But again, nowhere near. This is a fringe playable, versus cards you actually want in your deck, like Rabid Bite, Infiltrator, and to an extent Marauding Blight Priest, depending on what archetype you're in. Big flop, Hagra Constrictor. I think this is supposed to be one of the big payoffs at common for the +1/+1 counters green-black deck, and it just hasn't come together. This is the 2 and a black snake. It's a 0/0 that comes in with 2 +1/+1 counters, and creatures with +1/+1 counters on it that you control have menace. This can be a big payoff. It just never seems to actually happen.
Yeah, it's not a card I've ever put in my deck.
Right, and it's sad because I think that if you would have asked R&D, they would have said, this is a pretty good payoff for that archetype. I mean, if all your creatures have menace, it is a real pain to enter
it's
combat.
very powerful.
It just doesn't happen often enough.
Yeah.
Angel Heart Protector. This is the other side of the Marauding Blight Priest, although the Blight Priest pulls rank on it pretty hard. It's 2 and a white for a 3/2. When it ETBs, another creature gets indestructible until end of turn. Again, a fine playable, and it can fill out the Clerics that you might need in a Clerics deck, but not something we're going to consider here. Farsight Adept, similar card, 2 and a white. This one's a 3/3, and it's also a wizard in white, which is something that you don't see. That's the exception there, as normally they're Clerics or Warriors. But when it ETBs, each player draws a card. Kind of a weird design on the card, but I've played it a fair bit.
Yeah, it's a really good card for getting your party numbers up, because it almost always offers a unique type that you don't have in white decks. And, if you have to, a 3/3 for 3, even with the card draw on both sides, is still just perfectly serviceable. So I like Farsight Adept. I would not take it here, but I do think it's a fine card.
Yeah, and, we noted the downside when we first saw it of your opponent getting access to that card before you do. And that is a downside, but it hasn't ended up being like a crippling one where it's more like a minor downside rather than something that prevents you from putting the card in your deck. All right. Now here's a heavy hitter. When it comes to commons, this is one of the best. It's Into the Royal. So that's the 1 and a blue, return to non-land permanent to its owner's hand, and you can kick it for 1 and a blue extra to draw a card as well.
Oh yeah, Into the Royal is great. This is clearly
I'm taking
the pick
this.
right now.
Yeah, easy pick at this point.
I've never had a deck where I had access to too many copies of Into the Royal. Let's put it that way.
Same. And blue is a place I want to be as well. It all just lines up. Next is Highborn Vampire, 3 and a black, 4/3 warrior. Nope. So now we get to the uncommons, and well, we have found a card that actually bumps Into the Royal off here. It is Roost of Drakes, the mythic uncommon for this.
Why did you slow roll us, Marshall? Why didn't you just? If you had just told us we had a Roost of Drakes, I could have enabled the roost.exe bot that I have going, which is whenever someone tweets at us asking, "What would you take here?" It just answers Roost whenever there's a Roost in the pack.
It is funny because there's been like this developing story on Luis and I's Twitter when people ask, where at first we were just like, Roost, go with Roost, gotta be Roost. I think I'd go Roost here, Roost. And then at some point, Luis was just like, I'm getting to the point where I just tell people to take Roost over everything in the set. And now he's written an executable to just tell people to take Roost. So Roost of Drakes is the most powerful card in this pack, bar none. It is better than most of the rares in the set. And we have an interesting rare to put it up against here. And we'll talk about that in a second when we get there. Our next card, though, is Taunting Arbor Mage. That's the 2 and a green 2/3 with kicker for 3, and everything has to block a creature of your choice that turn. But again, it just doesn't hold up to Roost of Drakes. And then we've got Spikefield Hazard. That's the land that taps for red and ETB's tapped, or you can pay red as an instant to deal 1 damage to any target. And if that target would go to the graveyard this turn, it gets exiled instead. Again, a really solid card that you would like in any red deck, no matter what. But just Roost of Drakes just dominates this entire pack. Now, this does get kind of interesting. So our rare is actually a mythic rare. And on top of that, it's also blue. And on top of that, it also has kicker. What could it be, Luis?
Is this the Seagate Stormcaller?
No. Wow. You actually nailed that's really good. No, it is the other blue mythic rare with kicker.
Other blue mythic rare with kicker?
Yeah, I think it's the first of its type to have kicker, at least that I remember.
Oh, it's Jace, the Planeswalker.
Jace, the Planeswalker. So Jace, Mirror Mage, 1 blue, 4 loyalty Planeswalker with kicker 2, and it has and if you kick it, you get a copy of Jace that has loyalty 1, and it has +1 scry 2 and 0 draw card, and then he loses as much loyalty as that card's converted mana cost. This is a very good Magic card. This thing, every time I've played it, I've been happy with it. I've been able to manipulate it so that I'm often putting lands on top and drawing them so that Jace stays around. If I need a specific card, I mean, if I can kick this, I can scry 4 or scry 2 twice that turn, and that means I can really churn through a big chunk of my remaining library to get to the things that I need. And you can absolutely use it as a long-term card advantage engine as well. So an excellent card, but Luis, I'm not going to lie. I take Roost of Drakes over it every time here.
Oh yeah. I don't think that's particularly close. It's
Agreed.
Just Roost of Drakes is just such a good card. It's a value engine and a finisher. It enables itself. So I think that Jace is a good card. I think that Jace would be the card I would pick next out of this pack.
I would too.
I think Jace is better than Into the Royal, but in general, I would just take Roost of Drakes over almost everything. I mean, yeah, I would take like a Drana over Roost of Drakes, for example, but there's just not. I think like Leyline Tyrant's probably better too, but I don't even know about that. Actually.
Well, yeah, because the one thing that is good for those cards, right, is that every time you resolve them, they do exactly what they do, and what they do is really, really powerful. When it comes to Roost of Drakes, I have beaten it before. And the way that I've beaten it before is when it wasn't in the green-blue kicker deck, it was thrown into like a blue-black or something deck where they had 4 or 5 kicker cards total, including the Roost. So it was a totally fine inclusion in the deck. But you know what it didn't do? It didn't make a Drake every turn or every other turn for the rest of the game when I was able to combat it on some level, right? When they play it on turn 4 in the kicker deck and then kick 3 spells in a row. Like, you are not winning that game ever. Like, that is an absolute obscenity of a situation. When you first pick Roosted Drakes and you end up in blue red, let's say, you play it and it's a good card in your deck. It's not broken like it is in the green blue. So I think that's where the argument would be if you wanted to make it on taking a card that was always extremely good. Again, I don't, these arguments are more theoretical because there isn't a world where I wouldn't take the Roost of Drakes, because you get that absurd upside potential where if you do have it in a heavy kicker deck, it's the best card in the set. I mean, I really think it's better than any of the other bomb rares in that deck, you know, like in a deck with 7 kicker cards or 8 kicker cards or something like that. Like, I do think it's better than Drana or the Dragon or any of those other cards. It's just, you don't 100% of the time get that, and you have to keep that in mind. Okay, sweet crack-a-pack there. Two big blue kicker cards going at it. But with that, let's get into our Patreon questions here from our patrons. Thank you, everybody who submitted questions, and we're going to get to as many of them as we can. Our first one comes from our friend Alex Ullman. Again, we mentioned Alex before, but does writing and primarily is a specialist in the Pauper format. Even has his own Patreon for that. You can search him, Alex Ullman, on there, and he gives you access to like his spreadsheet that he uses to track the metagame and stuff like that if you're a patron. It's pretty sweet. And Alex says, hey guys, we've seen some recent formats that were tough on constructed, but good for limited. Is there something about making good draft formats that puts pressure on constructed, or are they unrelated? Great question, Alex. So is there a correlation? I mean, there is this fundamentally weird tension, Luis, between trying to put the cards in a booster pack, right, that would make for a great limited format. Like, we've complained before when they print completely obscene, broken mythic rares that are clearly aimed at standard or other constructed formats. And as drafters, you wouldn't have a card of that power level, in the set. Does it go the other direction too?
No, I don't think that it is. Like, that's not entirely true. There is some relation. I think part of what has made constructed worse is everything needing to have draw a card on it or replacing itself in some way. Like Omnath, for example, drawing a card I think was just egregious. Mm-hmm. But that isn't what ruined, or the cards that ruined constructed were not necessary for limited. If you look at the cards that have made constructed bad, like a lot of them are mythics like Uro and Omnath and Oko. And you have cards like Wilderness Reclamation, which did nothing in limited, or you have cards like Fire's Invention, which was good in limited, but it was a rare and it was nowhere near a bomb rare. So I think that some of the same philosophies have led to some of the issues, which is, again, that everything is trying to draw you extra cards or be, really powerful. Like the average limited format, I think there's so much more card selection. There's, whether it's cycling or the spell lands or a lot of cards that just say draw a card on them. But I don't think that necessarily means that you're in this. It's a false dichotomy to say, well, would you rather have constructed be bad but limited be good, or vice versa? The rares drive constructed and don't impact limited that much. Like, we complain about glory bringers, and mostly we don't complain about the mythic rares, Marshall. It's when there's a rare. It's when there's an actual normal rare that we feel should have been mythic. Mm-hmm. That's what actually impacts constructed or limited. When you have Tetzimok or Glorybringer at rare instead of mythic rare, it's just like, is this necessary? But yeah, I don't think you could make the argument that Glorybringer or Tetzimok ruined those formats. They made the formats worse, but they didn't ruin them. Right. So
yeah, it is funny because if anything, the answer just solidifies that these constructed players are trying to encroach on our limited fun, right? Like even cards like that you mentioned, like Wilderness Reclamation, those are spots that could be taken by an interesting playable card in limited, and instead they're a constructed plant of some sort, right? Yeah. The opportunity cost of a sweet limited card does go away with something that narrow, so. Get off our lawn, constructed players.
Yeah, I think that you can give credit for limited because the limited sets have been very good, while also saying, hey, constructed's been kind of a dumpster fire. What's up with that? Mm-hmm. And I think it's a cop out to say like, well, limited's only good because constructed's bad. It had nothing to do with it. Like,
Okay.
I understand why you would want to investigate that, but I think it just happened that those two things, happened at the same time.
Yeah. And I mean, that's why I like the question from Alex, because, the rest of us out here are not game designers. And, when you see a game or a design philosophy or something, your brain goes into like the matrix mode where you can just like see it all come together. But for us normal people, we're like, well, maybe these are related, or, what could we do to fix this or whatever. And that's
not
like
exactly true, because I only do that when I'm getting my hourly. So.
Oh my God. Well, I guess we better hurry through these questions then, shouldn't we? All right. Wow. Next is from Andrew, who says, how do you disconnect yourself from the emotional side of the game? I get pretty tilted when losing games where I'm investing resources like gems or coins. I don't want to not enjoy the game. What's that?
Or time.
Or time, yes. I don't want to not enjoy the game, but it is very hard line for me to walk sometimes. And then Michael also followed up with a comment on that question and said, boy, I feel this, especially when I'm on 2 losses in a premier draft and the mana flood or screw shows up and I'm like, not like this. It can be really hard. And I feel you guys for sure. I mean, this is a question that we get a lot, because it is something that people have to deal with. And it's interesting because when you take on gaming, from a professional standpoint, this, for most people, not for everybody, but for most people, this usually does subside at some point. Not completely, right? If you lose, it's frustrating, and, you could have had a bad day or not slept well. There could be a lot of things that could put you on tilt. But, for the most part, like when Luis plays, I've watched Luis play hours and hours and hours and hours of Magic. And I know when he gets tilted, but his version of tilted is like, okay, I'm going to call it a stream. Like there's no like yelling or berating. There's no flipping of tables. There's nothing like that. And for me, that came from poker when I was, I'm sure, quite subject to tilt and stuff before doing it on a more professional level. But when you start busting out the spreadsheets and reading books and doing all of that kind of stuff and doing it for money that you actually need, it changes your mentality for sure about, how you do this. The other thing is, it's just like the games that we play, you lose a lot, right? Like on Magic, you're expected to lose a lot, even if you're great at the game.
I mean, I'm one of the best players of all time, and I lose about a third of my matches.
Right? It's just incredible, right? And for us normal folks, we're in the, call it 45 to 60%, range or something like that. And, especially if you're still learning, you're going to lose even more. But even if you're really good, you lose a lot, like Luis said. And, when it comes to poker, it's the same thing, right? Like even if you're really, really great, you can lose 4, 5, 6 sessions in a row. Not hands, sessions, like times when you go play for multiple hours. Like this is very, very common. And I know for me, what helped me eventually to kind of internalize that. And I don't know if it works for everybody, but for me, it was expecting it and sort of like visualizing it, not in like a predicting bad things to happen to me way, but like I remember I had a few moments while playing poker, and these translated directly to Magic, by the way, for the most part. And there's very similar things, which is like, I'll actually use a Magic example instead. So imagine that you're playing in a match that you really care about. It's a PTQ. You're playing for top 8. You're about to win your F&M for the first time. You're going to get to 7 wins, or get mythic on arena. And you get that first little twinge. Like, let's say you keep a 2-lander on the draw. You're like, I'm 86% to hit here. We're fine. You draw your first card comes up. It's not a land. In fact, it's a 6-drop. And you're like, oh God. Okay. We're all right. We still got another couple of chances at this, right? Then you get your next draw step. It's a 5-drop. And you're like, oh God. And now your brain starts to go into that mode where you're like, it's all falling apart. Like I was so hopeful. I was so close to meeting a goal here. And now it's just all, it's all going to come crumbling down on me. Well, what I try to do in that moment is say, okay, let's just give myself just a very short timeout and say, what happens if this goes down, right? My opponent will crush me. I will not play another spell. This is an absolute possibility at this point. How do I feel about it? Well, I think it sucks, right? I'm going to be honest with myself and say I'm pretty unhappy about it, but also recognize that I've been in the opposite position many times. And when that happened, I don't know that I really felt internally so grateful for the fact that my opponent was mana screwed, or that I recognized at that point that my opponent's pain is my joy here, right? And recognizing in that moment that at this point, it's my turn to take one for the variance gods, right? And my opponent gets to kind of have a free win here. And while that does not make me feel good about any of these things, it does help me prepare myself for that potential outcome. And then if I do draw a land, all right, game on, let's go, let's do this. And if I don't, I say, it's okay. You know, this happens to everybody. This has happened to Luis so many times he can't even count anymore, right? Because Luis has played so much Magic, and he's played so much high stakes Magic compared to like what I've played. And every single Magic player has to deal with this. It is not just you. I know it feels like it's just you, and I know it feels unfair. This is the definition of fair happening. This is how fair works. You have to take your medicine sometimes as well. And, you know, if you're able to in the moment, I think there's even one step further you can take, which is to say, hey, good for my opponent. You know, it'll be me at one point. It's not me today, but good for them. And that sometimes is a bridge too far for people that are really frustrated. But I think that you can kind of hit that point at some point in your career where you can actually feel a little bit of like, yeah, you know, hey, this person probably worked really hard at this too, and it's just their turn. I'll get it next time, that type of thing. It's hard though. You know, you're fighting against, sort of primal reactions to these things because you get these expectations built up and then they're not met. When was the last time you really tilted off, Luis, at a Magic game? Because I don't think I've ever seen you like truly melt down.
So,
I know you really well, and you're a subtle person in that way. So I can go, oh, Luis is tilting. I know he is. But again, Luis tilt compared to other people tilt is not, you know, it's another level.
To give you a good example, you guys covered my last round against Kai in the league weekend, and I made a really bad play game one. I just kind of autopilot countered a spell instead of using drown to kill a creature. And you could tell I was unhappy. You could see me on the cam there.
Yeah, you were shaking your head. Yep.
I was just like, wow, that was bad. But you know what? I played the next two games, I think, to the best of my abilities, ended up losing the match. That was the last match, but I think I can say with a high degree of confidence, and you'll agree that if that was the first match, it wouldn't really impact the rest of the day for me.
Right.
Like,
right.
I'm not thrilled about it. I still am not, but you know, it is what it is. I don't remember the last time I really lost it.
I've never seen you really lose it ever.
So here's the good news. I don't remember who asked the question at this point, but
it was Andrew. Andrew.
Yeah. Here's the good news. If you caring about the game is, I think, something you really, really don't want to lose, because if you don't care about something, what you don't want to become is jaded. Because everything Marshall said is true. Experience, time, understanding you made good plays, understanding that sometimes you'll make mistakes, understanding that you'll lose sometimes. All that stuff kind of goes into where you end up if you play really anything that has variance and competition in it. You know, it kind of washes people out who can't handle it. Because there's some people I know who can't. There's some people who've literally quit Magic or poker or fighting games because they're like, this is unhealthy for me. If I do this, you know, it's gonna make me unhealthy, and it's gonna be bad for me. So I just can't handle it. And everyone else who kind of gets there, they have found a way to kind of deal with it in a healthy manner. Or, well, in some people's cases, not one, and they keep playing anyway. But that's unfortunate.
Right.
But at the end of the day, where you don't want to end up is not caring about the results. I always think it's a good sign that I get invested in these things, because if I didn't care about the results, man, that would just be so lame. Yes. It would just be really boring.
Yes.
And apologies, I'm trying not to use lame as a pejorative. So I think that's just it's hard for me. It's a little ingrained in me, but that would be, I think it's really unfortunate if you're doing something you don't care about. Whenever someone's like, wow, you're getting tilted, you know, it's like, no, I'm not getting tilted in that it's not like making me like lose my mind or play badly or making me too unhappy. But when you watch and I get frustrated about a match, or I obviously care about a match, that's great. That means I'm doing something I care about. If you watch, you can watch. There's plenty of people, if you want, who clearly don't care about what they're doing, you know, and they're playing because they feel they have to, or they're playing because this is what they do. If that's where you end up, like, if you're 99% of people, and you're doing this for fun, you're playing Arena for fun, I would advise you to not play it if you're not having fun, if you don't care about the outcome of the matches. Yeah. Find something you do. When I play Among Us, I care about the outcome of the matches.
Yeah.
I still remember the ones I lost because I made a mistake, or the ones I won because I made a great play.
Right.
And that's what makes the game fun.
Yes.
One of my earliest sign-offs was talking about how frustration in games is really powerful and good.
Mm-hmm.
And the game I used back then was League of Legends, still a great example, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
When you lose a game and you're frustrated, that often makes you want to play more, and it can be a really good motivator. Of course, it can go too far. Of course, it can end up, in a bad place. But in general, I firmly believe it's great to care about things. You'll learn the more you play any of these things how to like cope with that, and that's really good skill for just life in general. So
yeah,
it's great news that you care. Sometimes that means you'll feel bad, but I think on balance, it's just so much better to care about things than to just put yourself to not care about them. Our advice is not stop caring. It's know how to handle the disappointment.
Right. And that's the word I want to focus on, what you just said there, because if the question was, how often have you seen Luis like tilt off? I would say I've never seen him like literally just lose it. Right. I know when he's frustrated with himself, and I can sense that or see it, but it's subtle. But if somebody asked me, how often has Luis been disappointed at the outcome of an event? I would say many times. Right. Like most of the time, even if it didn't go your way. Right. Where I've seen you devastated after a tournament or a result, right? I mean, this is a useful skill, is to be able to separate out that whether you're tilted because something bad happened to you and that makes you feel angry or frustrated, or, your play is going to be affected, or even your life is going to be affected because of it, versus the natural feeling of disappointment at not having met a goal or not having achieved something that you care about. Right. And that ties back into what you just said. It's okay to feel disappointment, right? I think that tilt comes from poor expectations management. And what I mean by that is when I hear people start to spout off about the shuffler or this, there's this entitlement to it that they are supposed to win. And when that doesn't happen, there must be a reason. And that's not how these type of games work. It's not. You are not supposed to win any game that you play. If you're Luis Scott-Vargas, you are supposed to win 69%, 70%, 60%, whatever of your high level matches over the course of time. On any given match, you are not supposed to win. Period. And if you sit down thinking like, well, I'm probably better than this player, or, hey, I listen to LR, so I have an edge on them, and therefore I should win, you are wrong. You are simply wrong. So the fact that you lose any individual match or even a string of matches together is expected. So when it does happen, you shouldn't act like you had no idea that this was possible or whatever.
Just as a closing thought, because this was a pretty long question or answer, I still think that the most valuable thing Magic has taught me is learning how to deal with things not going my way. Mm-hmm. And that's just a valuable skill to have in life. And we talk about it a lot, because it's important to have,
super important.
Beating the entitlement out of you is just, through mana screw and match loss after match loss is really good, because I think entitlement is one of the least pleasant qualities anyone can have.
It really is in all ways. Next question comes from Jason, who says, what was your earliest favorite Magic card? And do you think it has influenced what type of a player you are today? That's a sweet question. What was your kind of, what card hooked you way back in the day?
Honestly, Wrath of God was in the first pack I opened, and I still remember that experience. That experience is still core to my Magic playing life.
Oh, that's sweet.
Yeah, just cracking that pack of Revised. There's a starter deck, actually, of Revised, getting a Wrath of God, a Dancing Scimitar. I don't know. I still remember. I don't just remember the cards. I know what these cards all look like, but I remember how I felt when I first saw the cards, and the sense of wonder and excitement, because I'd never seen a game like Magic before.
Yeah. How old were you at that time about?
I was 11.
Mm-hmm. Incredible.
So, that people, kids these days, people these days who get into games, they now know that there's 50 TCGs they could get into, or, there's all these games competing for your time. You're looking at, wow, League of Legends is awesome, but do I want to play League of Legends or Dota, or do I want to play Teamfight Tactics, or, there's just a million of everything. Magic was like the first TCG.
Mm-hmm.
It was there. And I looked, and I remember this is incredible. This just blows my mind. I didn't at that moment know that it was going to hook me for the rest of my life, but I knew that at that moment I was already hooked. This is 10 minutes into me meeting Magic,
Yeah. It's funny. For me, I look back because when I played back then, similar time frame, but I'm older than Luis. So I was in high school and it was like, I didn't play competitively. I didn't even play against other people other than my best friend Jay, and then to a certain extent Ryan. But I mean, we didn't even. This was so Wild West, at least for me. I was like a casual player during that time, so that meant like I barely knew the rules, right? Like I really enjoyed building decks and trying to like come up with combos. Like I don't know, I was some Johnny back then, but that was really where I was at. And the card that comes to mind that I really liked back then, and this is just very strange. In fact, I would say it's bizarre. Bazaar of Baghdad. I loved that card. I bought one. I scraped together money to get one because I liked the artwork and the fact that it was cool. I never put it in a deck. It was terrible back then. Like there weren't ways to abuse it like there are now. It was like a stone unplayable card. But my favorite set was Arabian Nights. And that was to me like the card that really jumped out to me. I loved lands. I don't know why. And so I will say that was my card. And no, it did not affect anything today because I don't think I've ever played a Bazaar of Baghdad or anything like it. I'm not like a big, graveyard. I certainly am not a fan of the dredge deck.
While we're looking back at Bazaar of Baghdad, I made a Bazaar of Baghdad deck a couple of years after I started playing, and it was a black-green deck that was trying to literally animate dead Baron Sengir. So that should tell you the power level of the Bazaar of Baghdad decks back then.
That is incredible. Next question comes from Corey, who says, to LSV, when you see other players in the MPL eating on camera, do you feel like they're basically net decking life from you?
Oh yeah. When I saw someone eating a burrito last week, it's like, yeah, I mean it's a good play, so I got to support it. But like I invented it, so
yeah, trademark Luis Scott-Vargas. In fact, Corey even says follow up. Do you feel like a proud papa when it happens to be a burrito? I guess you answered that question for Corey. Oh, that's great. You're an influencer, Luis.
Okay, here's a little aside about this. One of my favorite forms of comedy is comedy when you have a limited perspective or a very small amount of space to work with. To give you another example, when I got PT feature matches, I always know who's in the booth because I would always keep track of that. I would do things in my match to mess with them.
And them. Marshall, really, actually, but here's the thing: when I'm in a PT feature match, I can't talk. They're not getting my audio. They're not getting my face. All they're getting is my cards. But that's still enough of a canvas for an artist to paint a great picture. Yeah, it is true. And you and I work well in that way because I always pick up on the stupid little nonsense that you're doing. And I guarantee that there's people in the booth that wouldn't get that you were messing around, like
whether it's playing lands in front or at some point, like I remember you were covering a draft and I opened a foil Ulamog and I immediately flicked it to the front and pretended like I was going to take it, but then obviously took something else instead.
Yeah. And I knew that. I'm always he's not taking it. He's just
I'm always
messing.
on the lookout for just little opportunities like that to liven up the broadcast. And in the case of the player cams, they have me on cam. What can I do with that? I can eat a burrito. That would be great.
Yeah. I mean, you were going to do it anyway, right?
Well, I also was going to do it anyway.
Yeah. This next question comes from Luke. He says, if you think it's appropriate for your listenership, I'd love to hear power rankings for alcoholic beverages, be as general or specific as you like. And Mo said, that was my question too, except more specifically cocktails and craft beer.
Well,
so this one's going to be on you.
For Marshall, the ranking goes Arnold Palmer, number one, no vodka, nothing like that, just Arnold Palmer. Everything else is tied for last.
Yeah, then there's sparkling water and then the rest of the world. Yeah. Yeah, I don't really drink. I mean, I'm not like literally a non-drinker. Like I don't have like a rule for myself or something, but I don't enjoy it. I don't like the taste. I never feel like doing it. It's probably been 2 years since I had any alcohol. So I'm basically just a non-drinker. So I can't really answer your question, Luke. But Luis enjoys a beverage from time to time.
Yeah. I don't drink a ton, but my power rankings, I basically don't drink anything like whiskey or bourbon or any of that stuff. Not for me. At least hasn't been so far. I like red wine quite a bit more than white wine. I like
What's your favorite kind of beer? Or do you like ciders or
I like sour beers or like Belgians, like the saisons, stuff like that. And I like spicy drinks, like jalapeno margaritas. Like that's like the only time I'll have like something other than wine or beer, pretty much. But it's not a huge like part of my consumption. I don't know. It's just not something I've ever super gotten into. Also, knowing me, like I'm glad it's not something I'm really into, because like the things I'm into I tend to be really into. So that I'll have like a beer in the evening or a glass of red wine with dinner or whatever, but that's about it.
Yeah. Next one comes from Andy, who says, I've been waffling on how open I should stay while drafting in formats that have archetypes that are clearly better than others, which, by the way, Andy, is most formats. Is it better to stay completely open and draft the hard way, or stay open in a way that puts you into better archetypes? I feel like it's hard to pivot if I'm drafting black-white clerics or something like that. Thanks, as always, for the great info. You're welcome, Andy. And this is a subtle question, right? Because it is definitely better to draft the hard way and stay open. But that doesn't mean what you will find yourself doing is adjusting the power level of cards based on the color that they are and therefore the archetypes that they go in, right? Like, for example, you might open two quite good cards. Let's say Nahiri's Binding and Into the Royal. Now, Into the Royal is a much better card, but part of the reason why Into the Royal is a much better card is because it's blue. And blue is a better color than white in the format in most scenarios. So that would be something that you should have built into your card evaluations automatically, where these cards, even if you have the perfect power level evaluation in a vacuum, you are not comparing them apples to apples in that way. You are also putting another layer of evaluation on top that says, well, I've opened two great gold uncommons. Which one should I take? Well, if one of them is the black-white cleric that goes in the cleric's deck, and the other one is Brushfire Elemental, right? Brushfire Elemental is a pretty powerful card. But you know what? The other card's better and goes into a much, much better archetype. So you will default to that as well. And that's not solely based on the fact that it's in a vacuum, a better card. I could easily see a world where they designed this Zendikar set, so that Brushfire Elemental was much better than that cleric, where you wouldn't even look at that cleric if there was more support for the Brushfire, for example. So, you are automatically kind of doing this if you're sticking to the tenets of drafting the hard way and trying to stay open for as long as you can.
It really just depends also on the format and the archetypes. Mm-hmm. We like black-white clerics, and we're a little more inclined to lean in there, but it kind of works the reverse too. I actually think red-green landfall kind of sucks. So
it's terrible.
I would take a worse card than Brushfire Elemental over Brushfire Elemental for that reason. Same like, there's some formats like in Core 21 draft I didn't like, or M21 draft I didn't like, for example, like green-white very much. Even if my first 3 or 4 picks were like, oh, green's open, and then there was a good white card fifth, sometimes I would just not take it because at that point in the format, I knew that being in green-white wasn't really an option. It's going to be really hard for me to end up in, green-white in like Zendikar draft, for example, in Zendikar Rising draft. I just don't think that those two colors combine well. So I'm not going to like force clerics, but I will definitely force not green-white, as in right. I won't let myself get lured into it, even if I get a 5th pick Marasa Rootgrazer or something, because I just think at the end of the day, you're not going to want to be in green-white. And
right.
That's just format knowledge, and there's no hard and fast rule.
Right. But the key is that you're applying that extra layer both on the I don't want to go that direction or I do want to go that direction. If you take that out of the equation, then you're drafting badly at that point. So keep up what you're doing. The drafting the hard way thing, Andy, is it incorporates that in kind of naturally, assuming that you know what's going on in the format, which is why you're here listening to the show. Next question comes from a different Luis. This is Manowar Elves, by the way, who says, hello, Luis and Marshall. I've been struggling a bit with construction of aggressive decks. Is there such a thing as too many creatures? When should I go to 15 land? Should I prioritize combat tricks more highly? Thanks again for all the content. So is there such a thing as too many creatures? Absolutely. My aggressive decks typically have between 15 and 18, depending on what kind of synergies and things I have for my other cards, right? If I have cards that put a bunch of +1/+1 counters on my creatures, I'll bump it up on the higher end of that. I don't want to go below 14 or 15. These decks really do need onboard presence and repeat damage sources, which is exactly what creatures are in these decks. When should I go to 15 lands? Rarely. I almost never do. If I effectively curved out at 3 with like 2 4-drops, I might do 15 lands. But what I found is that even if my aggressive deck has like a 5-drop, let's say 3 4-drops and everything else is below, is that it is still critical that I curve out with these decks. If I miss a land drop, it's almost death, right? Like if I don't hit my 3rd land drop with these decks, I still want to do that. So I usually will only go down to 16. But I guess there's worlds where you could do 15, and there's certainly been certain archetypes that support it. What's your take on that one, Luis, on the 15 lands thing?
Oh, I almost never go to 15. The reason that the cycling deck good is because you drew 7 extra cards by turn 3. So you would have to play 14 lands, otherwise you'd flood out.
Right.
For most decks, aggro decks are in a spot where their window to win the game closes pretty rapidly if they stumble. And that's part of the reason that I think that aggro decks tend, like really, really aggressive decks, tend to struggle sometimes in both limited and constructed, is their first 3 or 4 turns need to be pretty good for their strategy to work. Granted, when they do, sometimes you just win the game in a landslide. Like you've played games where it's turn 3 and your opponent could just concede and save yourselves the time.
Right.
But as a result, I think playing 15 lands is not where you want to take risks, because if an aggro deck draws too many lands but curves out well, it's still going to win. If it only draws 2 lands and it can't go 1, 2, 3, that is a bigger problem.
Right. Next question was, should I prioritize combat tricks more highly? This is a tricky one, Man-O-War Elves, because the answer is yes. When it comes to putting them in your deck, you do want combat tricks in replace of any removal that you didn't get, but you generally don't have to prioritize them more highly in the draft. And that's part of the strength of these decks, is that combat tricks, many decks are completely uninterested in them, full stop. And so that means that you're able to get cards that are somewhat important to your game plan later in the pack. So you almost never want to prioritize them during the draft, but you do want to play more of them than you normally would. So there you go. Jonathan says, I only recently learned about hand smoothing in best of 1 in Arena. Is this something I should be thinking about when building my deck or deciding to keep an opening hand? So first thing, Jonathan, the deciding to keep an opening hand, it's already hand smoothed. So no, yeah. Once you're at that point, that is no longer relevant information to your decision. You just look at the hand and keep it if it works well, and mulligan it if not. Now, the theory being, from Jonathan that, well, what if my next hand could be better because it's hand smoothed? But I think that you can still just evaluate the hand in front of you at face value. But is it something I should be thinking about when building my deck? And the answer is, yeah, it is. It matters. Anybody who's played a lot of best of 1 recognizes that you mulligan very rarely. I feel wronged when I have to mulligan playing best of 1. I'm like, what is this? Like, I already keep everything anyway. And now with the hand smoother, I just never ever mulligan. What it means is that you can occasionally skimp on certain things. What are some of the places people should look, Luis, to adjust any deck building tiebreakers or whatever for best of 1 versus best of 3?
So the way the algorithm works, there's different land thresholds where it tries to, like, it looks at 2 hands and then and gives you the hand that most closely matches the number of lands in your deck. And so I think that there's like different breakpoints for it's better to have, I want to say it's better to have like 22 lands rather than 24 in constructed in terms of your opening hand for like a mono red deck or whatever. Mm-hmm. But honestly, I'm not super familiar with this stuff, like not to the point where I'd want to give people advice. Look for Frank Karsten's articles. He can tell you that better than I do. Yeah. This is the kind of stuff that I really don't like, So I just try not to engage with it, even though maybe I should. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel similarly. This is an edge that you can gain.
This isn't the kind of edges that I think are cool or fun to think about in Magic.
Yeah, they're uninteresting.
So
yeah. And I will say, I don't believe that there's a huge edge to be gained here. It's not like you can get away with playing 12 lands and it'll just make sure that you always have 3 lands in your opening hand or something. You may be able to get with slightly fewer. If I was on the fence about whether to play, say, 17 or 18 lands or 16 or 17 lands, I would gear myself down a land in best of one. That could push me over the edge on that decision, for example. But I'm not using this on a match-to-match basis to get like a huge edge because I don't think that there's one to be gained there. Scott says, and by the way, hi, Scott. It's nice to hear from you. Scott says, how many drafts does it take before you feel like you have a good enough understanding of the format to offer advice on it? How long until you've, asking 2 podcasts.
0.
How long until you've more or less, quote, solved it and feel like you can navigate any draft seat properly? And then, also Scott follows up with, this isn't a question, but please do a team draft with Lords of Limited once a format. That was insanely fun to watch. Well, we've retired as champions, so they will not be getting another shot at us. So
that said, the lad that Allied Strategies have been sniffing around. So
never heard of them. I never heard of those players before. Yeah, I don't know.
I called them Factor Fiction or Concentrate the other day, but
yeah, I was trolling Ben White's in your chat too, and he was like, "Okay, it's on." He was definitely ready to rumble. So hopefully we can get something going with that and make it a thing. But this is an interesting question, Scott, because you're asking 2 podcast hosts this. So technically we're giving advice about the format before the format's even out in the form of our set reviews. But we're very careful with that, right? You know, we always make sure to mention at the beginning of each set review that this is our starting point and that we don't have full context just yet. So this is to help you avoid major pitfalls and get a rough understanding of what's going on in the format. But, you know, I don't come in, like, it's sort of a core tenet of LR. Like, I have seen people come and go over the years with limited and other forms of Magic content where they've got the big voice, right? They say things very as a matter of factly, and people listen to that because it sounds like they know what they're talking about. And people are kind of like, I don't want to do the work myself. I'll just listen to you. We are the opposite of that here. We want to enable you to figure out these things on your own with our help. And we are very much a give a person a fishing rod rather than give them a fish type of a scenario here, right? Teach people rather than just give them information over and over again, because we want you to be able to come to these conclusions on your own and then combine them with ours and other people in your community or your friends to try to come up with the best thing. I've seen these people come, and I also mentioned I've also seen them go. Generally speaking, they're wrong when people come in with these super hot takes about, oh, this is the best color in the format, not close, and, you know, all that stuff. And it's like, you've done 5 drafts. Like, you just don't know what's going on. You just sound like you know what's going on. And if you listen to people like us or people like Ben Stark, they will say, this is my opinion, but I don't know. Like, I don't have a model. I don't have sufficient sample size. I don't have data or any type of really anything to make sweeping claims. And most of the time when people come in with those hot takes early, by the end of the format, those have changed. They're different by the end. So, you know, how many do I have to do before I start to feel confident about my takes and about where I'm at? I don't know. It usually ends up being like the 4th show of the format or so. Like, the initial impressions is just that. This is what I think I know right now, but I'm not staking my career on it. Probably 2 episodes after that, I start to feel like, okay, I've drafted all of the archetypes. I've probably seen most of the cards in the set by now multiple times, and I'm starting to really get a feel for what's working for me and what's not. That's about where I come in with it, Luis. What about you? And don't even say before the set comes out.
Well, I think that the more interesting part of the question is not when do you feel qualified really to give advice. It's at what point do you feel like you can navigate a draft well? Like, at what point do you feel like you've achieved kind of understanding of the format? For me, like, the biggest breakpoints are probably around 5 drafts in. I have a much better sense of like which cards are better or worse, but less on colors. Whenever someone asks me, what do you think the best color is? I'm like, well, I don't know yet. Also, like, that doesn't really matter yet. Like it'll you want to get there eventually, but I don't tend to focus on that super early. Then the second thing for me is at about 5 drafts in, I have a better understanding of card values. And about 20 drafts in, that's when I think I'm pretty prepared to run a draft in this format. Because when I'm 20 drafts in, that also means we've done probably like two to maybe 3 shows, depending on the format. Usually like 2. And I've watched people on Twitch play a bunch. I've watched Ben Draft or whoever.
Yeah.
So
maybe heard some discussion, seen some chatter online, talked to somebody. Exactly.
Yeah, if you want to know when I'm like when it comes to like a pro tour, I'll try to draft around 50 times before the pro tour if I can. So that gives you a good kind of a good understanding of like what I think is proper preparation. That being said, I think around 20 drafts in, I feel pretty good for most sets of like understanding what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many I've done now. It's probably approaching 100 or somewhere in that range. And like right now for Zendikar Rising, which has been out for a long time, I feel very good about where I'm at. Like, I feel like I know the cards, I know the stuff, and I know the archetypes I care about and which ones I want to avoid, that kind of stuff. So yeah, somewhere in there. Nikolai Bolus says, hey, Marshall and Luis, I was wondering if you think draft or sealed is a more skill-intensive format. In a tournament with both, like a limited Grand Prix, how do you balance your practice to feel prepared for both? Thanks for all you do. Thanks, Nikolai. Hard to define skill intensive, but just at the face of the question, I would say draft is way, way, way more skill intensive. Like you sit somebody down for a draft, there's a lot going on in a relatively short period of time, and they need to kind of work their way through. Now, sealed tends to be criminally underrated in how skill intensive it is, but
just about to say that.
Right. But compared to draft, I think draft is way more skill intensive.
Yeah. Draft, exactly what you said. Draft is much more skill intensive, but sealed is underrated. The people who play tons of sealed, like Michael Jacob or Paul Rietzel, tend to do well because they're very good at sealed.
They crush it.
There are skills in sealed. That being said, if you ask me, all right, you're going to play in a tournament with a bunch of people, and you can choose for it to be sealed or draft, it would always be draft. I think that format is just much more interesting and skill intensive.
Yeah, same. The other thing, my general workflow for this stuff is to dedicate, for like if I was going to go to a limited GP, for example, is to dedicate my time at first to drafting because it's harder and you need to know more. That gives me a baseline for what's going on in the format. And then when I start playing sealed decks to practice, I'm looking for things that are different. What cards went up in value that I don't really pay attention to in draft and that I need to here? What cards go down in value? And what are the trends that I start to see about, like, can I splash reliably in the format? Is that something I should be looking at? What are the types of decks that I end up facing down? That kind of thing. So I usually start draft is sort of like, that's my snapshot of the limited format. And then I'll make adjustments to sealed from there. Brandon says, how do you deal with streaks? Sometimes I feel like everything falls into place. Sometimes it feels like everything falls into place your way and you can't lose, but other times it feels like you can't catch a break. I know you have to stay the course and just keep making the best percentage plays, but any tips on how to cope with this mentally and emotionally? This is a little different from the tilt question, though it has a lot of the same aspects to it, right? It won't be as frustrating if you don't expect these things to happen. But I can tell you, for me, touched on this a little bit on the tilt question, but recognizing when things are going well for you, it helps me balance out when they don't. Because I think that the people that I've seen that have the worst tilt issues, when they're running hot, they don't recognize it. They expect it. They just think, well, yeah, of course I drew my sweet spell and won the game. Where people that are more balanced out go, wow, I am running hot. Because I'm going to tell you, people think that running hot in Magic means like top decking the thing at the time that you need it. It doesn't. It means you hit all your land drops and you got to play your cards out in the order that you hope to play them out in. And you drew the better part of your deck rather than the worst more often than not. Running hot means you sit down and your hand matches up perfectly for what your opponent's trying to do. You have 2 spike field hazards and you're like, well, I guess I'll keep. And then they play 2 1 toughness creatures to kick off the game and you get to get 6 value off of your land while you draw more lands. These are things that feel terrible when you're on the bad end of them. And it's really prudent to make sure that you go, I'm running really hot right now. This feels good. I'm going to enjoy this. I'm going to run up the score and get the most I can out of it. But that helps even me out because that way it doesn't just feel like I'm always either running average or below average, right? Like I have to run hot sometimes, but a lot of people just don't recognize it when they are.
Well, the worst crashes I've ever seen in Pro Magic are the people who show up and get the good part of the variance first and like kick things off by doing well in their first PT, winning their first GP, or anything of those of that nature, and then they're in for a rude awakening when sometimes you lose a lot. You don't win every tournament you play in. I always use the example that like Paulo was silver for 2 years. I went from platinum to silver in a year. Like these things happen, and if you're not mentally prepared for them, you're gonna have a bad time. For most people, I think when you're on the good streak, to do what Marshall said, recognize, hey, things are working out well for me right now. I'm getting the draws I need. It's not always going to be this way, though you can still celebrate and enjoy them. And then when you're on the bad side of things, well, sometimes taking a break is a good idea. Like one of the things that is great about Magic is that it's a game. You can put it down, you can pick it back up again. So I'm always an advocate for taking a break when you need to, whether that's from Magic, from really anything you're doing that's causing you frustration.
Yeah, don't be afraid to do that. We'll be here. We'll get you caught right back up again. Don't worry.
Of course.
Next is AW Cheese, who says, I'm getting interested in following Pro Magic. And then this gets scary, Luis. Could you explain the format league structure? I'm like, oh, no. But then AW says, of the standard tournament that took place on Twitch last weekend, I enjoyed watching some of Luis and Reed's matches. How do you guys think the tournament went?
I actually really liked it. So I said this on stream last time, and one of the things that's really cool. Well, first, let me explain the structure, and I'll tell you why I think it's cool. Mm-hmm. The structure for league play this year is there are 7 weekends of league play, 84 matches total, 12 each weekend, and the top 4 for my league, Rivals League, go to the MPL, and then a bunch of the people from like 5th through whatever play in a gauntlet where if they do well, they're in MPL, and if they do poorly, they're in Rivals. So again, they're not falling out. And then there's 4 people who just stay in Rivals, don't have any opportunity to move up, but they're in Rivals. And then the bottom 12, they become challengers. They get kicked out of Rivals. For MPL, it's somewhat similar. Top 4 stay in the MPL. 5 through like 12 or whatever playing a gauntlet, 13 through 24 playing a different gauntlet. But the MPL, the worst case for MPL, they're still in Rivals. They're not going anywhere. So those are the stakes we're playing for, which is league placement. And those are big stakes. Getting promoted to MPL is a big change from Rivals. Dropping out of Rivals is certainly something I don't want to do, right? Like right. That's unfortunate. And the way the points work is you get 1 point per match win. And then there's also points given away at some of the big tournaments in between, which is cool because it means that not only does league play matter, but also the big tournaments matters. Spiking a big high-profile tournament also matters as well. So you end up in a spot where you were, for the first time ever in professional Magic, getting to play enough rounds where we're actually going to get a pretty good sample of what people did this year, like in terms of how well did people prepare, who picked good decks, who played well. And we're getting 84 matches.
84 matches. Like that's
the average season in Magic for Pro Tours is less than that. It used to be that you played 64 matches in Pro Tours, and it wasn't 64 matches against other pros. It was like 32, 24 to 30 matches against pros, and then a bunch of matches against people who qualified for the Pro Tour but aren't pros. And that's fine. People who play at the Pro Tour are good. This is going to be the least spike rewarding season, and I think that that's really cool. It's not...
Well, you should say that differently. It's going to reward the spikes just fine.
Yes. It's going to be the season that rewards consistent, good play, good finishing, good deck selection more than any other season that we've ever had in Magic. Yeah. Because it used to be that if you went 12-3-1 at a Pro Tour and made top 8, you got rewarded like 5x the person who went, 11-5.
One win.
And there's only one win difference.
Yeah.
Here, I went 9-3. That's a great start. But if I go 3-9 next time, well, then I'm 12-12. It's not, I went 9-3 and I got 10x the points that someone who went 6-6, 6-6 went, because that's how the Pro Tours paid out. And that's fine. That's how tournaments should pay out. Generally, being top heavy makes sense. But this is cool. We get this league play, and we actually get to really find out over the long haul. I think a pretty good representation of, there's still luck, there's still variance, there's still all those things. But I think this will do a pretty good job of rewarding the people who I think put in the time, put in the effort, and have the skill.
Yeah, the round robin nature of it too, where you're always, you're going to be facing the same people and everybody's going to be facing everybody is really cool. I enjoyed covering the tournament. It did have a downside in that there aren't, for the middle parts, there's no breaks. I don't mean taking a break from the tournament, but what I mean is like normally the end of day one, there's a breaking point, right? Where it's like, are you going to make day two or not? And if you don't, you're out of the tournament. And then near the end of day two, there's am I going to make the top 8 or not moment? And then in the top 8, every moment's a big moment because are you going to advance through the bracket? And this was like, all right, that person won and now they have another win. Well, see you next time. So it's a little harder to build those longer term, or the shorter term narratives. And we have to kind of, as a commentator, we have to focus a little bit more on the longer term stuff, but the gameplay was excellent and we had some really fun moments and stuff too. So I enjoyed it.
Yeah. I think that the biggest thing that they could do to improve this tournament, and I gave them this feedback, was have also a prize per weekend so that every weekend the players are playing for something, coverage gets to talk about what it means and people get rewarded. Ray Sato should get something for going 11-1. That just, he smashed the weekend. I think that it would be appropriate to reward him for that.
Yeah, I actually gave that same feedback through my channels too. I just said, just a golden star or a whatever. So give him something. Next question comes from Hayden, who says, "My question is, which iconic duo do Marshall and Luis most closely resemble, and why? This can be anything like Sonic and Tails, Holmes and Watson, Stockton and Malone, Animal and Hawk and Mario and Luigi. No restrictions for the subject, time period, or whether the subjects actually exist." I remember one time, when Woody made that poster of us from Every Which Way But Loose, where you were, what's his name? Clint Eastwood, and I was the monkey.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. I got to dig that up. I saved that somewhere. I've never even seen that movie, but it was apparently a famous movie poster, and Woody doctored it horribly. I like Stockton and Malone, but I also grew up being a big fan of Stockton and Malone. The irony is that if Luis and I were Stockton and Malone, who are basketball players, for those who don't know, we would actually be switched though, because I would be the Stockton trying to set up Luis, for the big dunk or whatever.
Yeah,
but in real life, I'm bigger than Luis, so I would actually be the Malone in that case. Yeah. There's some issues there in real life as well. Did anything come to mind?
Timon and Pumbaa.
Oh, I love that. That is great. Yeah. Okay. That's it. We did it. We're Timon and Pumbaa from now on. Oh, Hayden, I was going to say thanks for the question, but really, I'm not happy you asked it. Eric is next. He said, "I reached Mythic last night for the first time, thanks to some extra time at home, and wanted to thank you all for the insight on the format." You're welcome, Eric, and congratulations. That's great. My question is that over this month of playing, my evaluations of some decks have been significantly different than the outcome. I've had between 0 and 2 wins with some decks that I thought were quite good. On the other hand, I've had quite a few 7-win runs with decks I thought were mediocre. How do you recommend sorting out the noise from the data here? I know that some of my thoughts, especially earlier in the format, were just wrong, and I just try to use my experiences to get better. The thing I want to focus on this, Luis, is this important? Is this something Eric should be devoting energy to, trying to predict how well a deck will do, any given deck will do? Especially on best of one on the ladder or whatever.
No, I don't think so. I don't think that's like very relevant info. Like, you should play to try to see what assumptions you're making. Like, look, if I draft the deck and I think it's awesome and I do poorly, I think, all right, good beats. But I do pay attention to why I lost. Like you can tell sometimes you draft a great deck and you get mana screwed twice, and then you play against a bad matchup and you go 1-3 or 0-3 or 2-3 or whatever. But if you draft a good deck and then you lose, and then you draft a deck you think is good and you lose, and you draft another deck you think is good and then you lose, and you're like, you know what? I didn't get mana screwed this draft. I played out my card. I just ended up not winning. At that point, I'm starting to think, okay, I'm making some assumptions that are wrong. Mm-hmm. But if I draft a deck that's good and then I win, then I think, okay, cool, this deck was good. Assuming, again, that I'm not, just getting horrifically lucky, like my opponents are just all getting mana screwed. And if I draft a deck that I think is, like if I draft a deck and I think it's bad and then I win, I don't think, wow, I must have made a lot of bad assumptions. I just think, wow, I ran pretty good. I thought this deck was a 3-3 and I ended up getting 7 wins. The results really just don't matter on an individual draft basis. What does matter is when a card is good. When you play a card and you're like, you had this experience many times, Marshall. You put a card in your deck that you think is like kind of mediocre, but you need another playable, and then you draw it and you're like, wow, that was pretty good. Mm-hmm. And then it happens like 2 more times, and then you're like, no, this card is good. Right. Like I think this card is good. You're like, wow, this card is really impressing me. That can happen with cards, or with cards that you're like, wow, I thought this card was good, and I keep drawing it, and it keeps being mediocre. Maybe this card isn't good.
Yeah, the Infiltrator we talked about on the Crack-a-Pack's a good example.
Right. Mm-hmm. It's done exactly that. Whereas something like Stonework Pack Beast, thought it was going to be good, and then it's just been great. Mm-hmm. So mm-hmm. you can kind of get a good sense of it. Or something like Ardent Electromancer. That's a card that has really impressed me in the right circumstances or right decks. When you're optimizing to go 2-drop into 3-drop plus red 2-drop, the card is very strong. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's not as useful to think like, wow, this deck's really good, but I lost, so therefore my assumptions are wrong. It's more on a card-by-card basis. I tend not to really predict too much what I think a deck is going to do or not do.
Yeah, I always have an idea in my head for how good I think it is, but I don't, I had a deck on stream on Tuesday that I thought was pretty darn good, and we 0-3'd with the thing. But when I look at each game, they were really close, really good games, right? Like I got them to 1, they killed me. I needed one more thing, that kind of thing, where it was like really like, it could have easily gone the other way, right? Maybe I made a mistake, something like that. And so I don't punish the list for that. It's just, hey, I faced 3 good opponents with good decks and we played really good games and I just didn't win them, and then last night I was playing and I had a stupid red-green deck and I went 7-0 with it. Like I just swept the whole thing with, Brushfire Elementals or whatever, which I would have predicted that deck would go like if I got to 4 wins with it, I would have been like, sweet, book it. Like, let's do that. I would have taken that if you offered it to me at this onset. And I ended up going 7-0, but also I ran hot. My opponents I generally faced slow opponents and I drew really well. And so, I don't think that red green is all of a sudden a great archetype. So dive into the data, right? You have information in front of you more than just this deck didn't win. And you can do a lot more with that. James says, hi guys, is there any possibility of getting a previous LR co-host update at some point in the future? Maybe. I can tell you what I know now. I saw John a few times before the pandemic, and he's working for a game company, doing game design, on I think they're doing a, blockchain style card game or something like that. So, he's in that space. You can see him on Twitter and stuff tweeting about it. That's the last I heard from him. Brian, I haven't heard much from, outside of just Twitter and that kind of stuff when he shows up on there, but he hasn't been playing as much Magic for sure. And, I think he's doing the same job that he was before. Ryan, of course, does his own stream over at Going Optimal now. And, that's kind of a sister stream to us. It's the same type of things that you get if you watch our streams or listen to the show. Ben Stark has a similar vibe, and Ryan is right in our wheelhouse. I mean, if you want, good evaluations, things broken down for you, and to see somebody doing this in real time, I highly recommend Going Optimal over on Twitch. And Ryan's also selling cards too. So he's kind of, into the Magic stuff there. So that's what I know. If we can get people
working on that too.
Huh?
He sells cards.
He does. Oh yeah. Yeah. He nice. Has his own little thing. Yeah. Next comes from Matthew. Do formats that encourage monocolor like Throne of Eldraine lead to healthier formats than multicolor sets like Ravnica and Khans? I don't know how you define healthy, Matthew, but they're not better, at least in my experience. The ones that properly support multicolor often end up being my favorite sets.
Yeah, I think multicolor is in general a stronger thing than monocolor. Monocolor reduces the amount of choices you have in a draft. Multicolor makes gives you a lot of interesting choices. So I don't think healthy or unhealthy is the way to look at this. That's not a spectrum that really makes sense to me. But in general, I do prefer multi to mono. Not saying monocolor is unplayable. It can be fine, but I think in general, you really do get more out of having more combinations rather than fewer.
Yeah, I think the way that puts itself out, at least trying to put it on the is this a healthy format or not spectrum, is that it makes the longevity lower. Like I won't, if it's a heavily mono featured thing, I won't draft it as long. And I guess I would describe that as less healthy than
like Throne of Eldraine, I think pulled it off pretty well, where there was like 15 archetypes, right? There was 10 2-color pairs and 5 monos. But that still is in general less, especially in where that goes wrong is when the monocolors are much stronger than the color pairs in those formats. Yeah. And then you end up in a spot where there's 5 decks instead of 10.
Yes, exactly. Next question comes from Soren, who says, "Hey, Marshall and Luis, I've been a listener since Luis's first show, and you're doing great every show." Thank you, Soren. Magic has changed a lot since then. The next big move in Magic is perhaps when Arena comes out on mobile. Prediction time. How much do you think you'll end up using Arena on your phones? Do you guess you'll stay mostly on your computers? Perhaps you can revisit the question in half a year or a year. Have a nice day. And Soren also says, stay positive and test negative, which I like that.
Well, yeah, revisiting the question is going to, or rather, no, I think we will have a much better understanding when we know what the world looks like. Right now, I don't really go anywhere, so I would not play it on mobile at all. I'm just in my house.
I want to play it on my iPad.
Yeah, no, that part's true.
That part sounds nice, but I don't predict that I'll play it on mobile that often. I just struggle with what the situation is. Like if I'm in the waiting room at a doctor for an hour, okay, that's fine. I would probably fire it up there for sure. But it takes a little too much attention for me to do like while I'm walking or something. And plus half the time if I'm outside, it's because I don't want to be on the computer.
Yeah.
So
it also will have to do with how well they pull it off.
Yeah, for sure. It is a very
we'll
big
see about that.
chore. Yeah. Good luck with that one, Wizards. It does seem like an extremely difficult thing to do really well. Timothy says, "Hey guys, as an avid cube drafter and designer of multiple cubes, I'd love to know what you think makes a draft format truly great from a design perspective. Also, do you have any pet archetypes or cards that you especially love seeing in cube draft?" What makes a draft format great? Like if you're going to play a cube that somebody else has designed, what are the things that you want to see, Luis, that you would say, okay, this is fun? I mean, the first one, it has to be diversity, right? That there's a bunch of different archetypes that you can play.
Yeah, I think having a lot of viable archetypes is really good. I think it's really important to have build-around cards or cards that change the pick order, because formats where the build-arounds don't really work and it's just, kind of ABC drafting, it's not that fun or replayable, because after, you've done everything, then every draft, it's like, well, card A is better than card B, which is better than card C. It's way more interesting when you end up in a spot where card C is actually much better than card A once you are drafting that deck. So, Cube does this fantastically. Almost everything in Cube is some kind of build around. Mm-hmm. So that's part of the reason I think Cube is so fun. And in general, I would say have exciting decks, have fun archetypes. One of my favorite archetypes in Cube is Birthing Pod, whether it uses Vanifar, Birthing Pod, or, anything like that. And, Fauna Shaman, Survival of the Fittest, you have this toolbox of creatures, you're getting value off ETBs. I like that deck a lot. It changes my pick orders, and I have a lot of fun playing it.
Yeah, for me, the Cube format that the Cube archetype that I always like to see is blue-black tempo with the cheap overpowered black creatures, which they don't make it in Cube anymore. And frankly, if I built a Cube, I probably wouldn't put them in, but I just have fond memories of when people always used to put these in, and you could get these really cheap counter spells, these really cheap black aggressive creatures, and cheap interaction in the form of removal. And I loved playing those. Yeah. Glory says, pros and cons of living in Denver and Seattle, thinking of relocating to either, and would appreciate y'all duking it out.
So it's going to be hard for me to say that you should live in Denver over Seattle, depending on what you do, or unless it depends on what you do and what your budget is or price range, how price sensitive you are. Seattle is like kind of a major metropolitan city, and Denver is like whatever a step below that would be. It is a major city, but it's just much smaller than Seattle. So Seattle's going to have a lot more of the big city type things, more restaurant options, more entertainment options, that sort of thing. Denver does have some really cool stuff going for it. And I moved here from the Bay Area, right? So I certainly understand that other experience. I like that Denver is a bit more affordable. Like it's just in general, it's cheaper to live out here. I really like the mountains. The mountains are really awesome. The air is nice up here. Well, it hasn't been this summer, but that's just because everything is burning down. But in general, the air is very nice up here. Mm-hmm. And I find the people to be really friendly. I think that's something Denver actually has a major advantage over Seattle. Just based on what everyone who's lived in Seattle has told me, the whole Seattle freeze thing is actually real, where people just aren't that friendly,
Yeah, and, once you know them, then they are. But on the outwardly, they're pretty standoffish. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas I've found people in Denver to be very friendly. They're both pretty progressive on what's legal in both states, so I guess that's kind of a tie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a tie for sure.
And I really like living in Denver. I find it to be a very pleasant place to live. It's big enough that there are plenty of different options for things. We've got a couple sports team. In fact, we're kind of crushing Seattle in that department. Because we have a basketball team.
Yeah, because you have a basketball team. Exactly. It must be nice to have one,
Hey, I've gone to a lot of Nuggets games that, you could go down there and get cheap tickets at the Pepsi Center. And when the Nuggets played like the Clippers, I got to sit in like the third row for like $100.
This is ridiculous. Is that even true?
Yeah, it's 100% true.
That makes it worse. Well, for living in Seattle, well, what are the downside? By the way, Glory did want to know what the
downsides in Denver is that there's not as much outside of Denver, whereas like Seattle, I think you can drive to Portland, for example, and that's a couple, like 3 or 4 hours. You can drive to Vancouver. That's like 2 to 3 hours, something like that.
Yep. Exactly right on both of those. Yeah. Yeah. For Seattle, I think Luis covered most of it. The big downside is cost, period. It is so expensive here now. And everybody thinks it's expensive where they live, but like, look at the list. It is actually really expensive here. We're talking New York, San Francisco-ish. Not quite to that level, but in that range. Very, very, very expensive to live here. But everything else I really like, which is why I haven't left. The scenery here is absolutely gorgeous. We have basically everything available to you as far as like if you like any outdoor stuff at all. We have mountains, rivers, oceans. We have places to hike, places to do biking, anything that you like as far as outdoor stuff. This is like heaven. And by the way, Denver is also fantastic for this stuff. These are both, very, very good. As you mentioned, the political temperament is similar between the two. For the most part, this is one of the most liberal places in the country. So that's something to keep in mind depending on your politics or whatever. I mean, I wouldn't say, that you couldn't move here one way or the other, but it's just something that to be aware of. I view that as a great strength, but not everybody will. The other major downside is traffic is absurd here. And again, this is one of those things that everybody thinks the traffic's bad, but I had an argument with Rashad about this. Yeah, right. I had an argument with Rashad about this a few years ago where I was saying about how bad it was. And he's like, well, you don't know what it's like in Chicago or whatever. And so we looked it up on the internet and we were like way worse. We're LA level. It's basically one of those things where we can't make more roads in the spaces where we have them for the major freeways. And that means that everything gets backed up around that. So that part can be difficult too. So we're dealing with big city problems in a city that's not that huge geographically. And that creates a lot of issues with housing and transportation and stuff. But really, and the prices associated, everything else though is great. The food is great. Heavy Asian influence here on many levels. And, I grew up eating, Asian foods of all sorts, and I still do to this day. And you can just get such great stuff here for that if you're into it. So all types of good stuff here. I would definitely recommend either, though. I've visited Luis in Denver and been there for a few GPs, and I've enjoyed it every time too.
Yeah, I've spent quite a bit of time in Seattle. I think that both places are fantastic places to live.
Yeah, good choices, Glory.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because you always have to look. There's places you'd be really happy to live in. There's places you would be willing to live in. Then there's places that you'd have to get bribed to live in. Like you got your dream job, but like it's in a place you don't really want to go, but you know, it's worth it. Or your SO really got a good opportunity or whatever, you know.
Right.
Seattle and Denver are both places that I'm like happy to live in.
Yes, for sure. Let's do one more question here, Luis. This one comes from Parker, who says, "Hi, Marshall and Luis. What's the best concert you've been to back when those were a thing?"
Oh, man. I'll let Marshall answer first.
Yeah, so I've actually been to a ton of concerts. There was a stretch when I was younger where I was going a lot, like quite often. But the one that comes to mind, there's two that jump out. One of the second place, the runner-up is a Tool concert, and Tool's probably my favorite band. And they put on an absurd show, and I went to go see them, and they just absolutely just killed it. It was awesome. But the one that really stands out the most to me is from the band Muse. And I don't listen to them quite as much as I used to, but I was very, very into them for a while. And a friend of mine actually found them way before they like blew up. And they came to town and they went to a place here in Seattle called Numos, which is a small venue. You know, it's a bar basically. That has a stage and place for you to stand or whatever. And we scrambled to get tickets to go watch Muse there. And this is, I mean, in Europe, they had already kind of blown up, but they just hadn't hit here quite yet, but they were. So it was like one of those rare times where 2 years later they were selling out stadiums or whatever. And in fact, actually, I went to go see them at, I think, the Key Arena here in Seattle or some, you know, they're selling out like a proper arena. But this is one with a few hundred people. It's dirty. It's close. And they killed. I mean, I stumbled out of that place just super sweaty and everything. But I remember thinking like, it is going to be really hard to top this. And I don't think I ever did, concert wise. So that's number one for me.
I'm going to cheat a little bit here. I'm going to say Hamilton. It's not a concert. It's a play, but it's solely music. Like it's 95% music. And it was one of the best, like, you know, kind of not just theater experiences, just one of the best, like, you know, event experiences I've ever had. There's a reason that everyone went nuts over it and just thought it was incredible. When plays come back, if Hamilton is something you can watch, I would recommend it. I'd recommend watching the movie. Like they did a stage recording of it and released it, which they normally don't do for Broadway plays, at least until not while they're running, but the pandemic kind of forced their hand. So that was pretty awesome. But I'm just not a big concert person, so I don't have a too remarkable of an experience. I went and saw Leonard Skinner in high school because my friend got free tickets, and it was an experience.
All right, that is admittedly not what I expected you to say. That you saw Leonard Skinner. That's really funny. All right, well, let's call it a show there, Luis. We've still got more questions, and we'll try to get to them either on the question of the week or if we can do another show or something. It gets kind of tricky to get them in, but we do appreciate everybody who submitted questions on there, and we'll try again. We try to get through as many as we can, but we only have so much time on the show. So let's call it there. If you want to find us on social media, I'm Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. You can find us. You can find everything related to the podcast at lrcast.com. That includes links to our streams and everything. And, you know, I've been streaming Tuesdays, right? In the afternoon, Pacific time, I fire it up usually about when Ryan stops his stream. I'll pick it up from there. And, we've been doing drafting. In fact, we hit Mythic last week, so that was fun, and you can come hang out. And again, the links and everything for all of that are at lrcast.com. And remind you that this show is brought to you by Channel Fireball. It's a place to go for everything you need, including if you need to sell your cards. This is something that happens a lot. It's kind of the circle of life for Magic players because Magic can be such an expensive hobby that you need to sell some cards that you're not using anymore to get some that you want to use, or maybe a box to do some seals with on webcam against your friends or whatever. And if you do, there's actually two options over at Channel Fireball now. You can do it the traditional way where you kind of look up each card, and then they'll tell you what they're paying for that card, and you can decide whether you want to send it in to sell it them or not. Or you can do U-Box We Buy, where you just throw all your cards in a box and send them in. Then the folks over at Channel Fireball will go through them and they'll make you an offer, and you can say, sure, I'll sell it for that. Or you can say, no, hang on to it for that. It's up to you. And you can check all that out over at channelfireball.com. That's going to do it for the show this week. We'll see you next time.
I just want to give people a quick PSA, kind of like we did, a couple years ago, which is that, there's a big election here in the U.S. And if you're in the U.S. and you have not voted, please vote. This is, I don't want to say this is an important year, because elections generally are important. That I don't find it super compelling to say, well, this election's more important than others. In a lot of ways it is, but in general, I just think that the voter turnout rate in the U.S. is a lot lower than we would want it to be if our goal was to have a democracy where everyone's voices are heard. The U.S. has a lot going on that makes that convoluted and not always true. I also understand that in a lot of places it's harder to vote, but I do firmly believe that it is my civic duty to vote, and I always do. Even if, like, where I live here in Denver, for example, when you're talking about like the presidential race, my vote, it won't make a big impact. That's not the same is not true for like local races. And there's also plenty of places where races are contested. And if everyone has the same, attitude of like, well, my vote won't matter, so why should I go? Obviously, we end up in a worse place. It's the same reason that we don't throw garbage out of our car windows, or at least I hope. Yes, it won't really matter if you do it. If everyone did it, we just live in a filthier, dirtier place that's worse. So please vote. Please take the time and effort to do so. It's one of the prices we pay for, living in the system we do and being in the country we are. And I like that other countries do a better job of registering people to vote. In some cases, it's actually mandatory to vote. Mm-hmm. And, I totally understand that too. So I hope our listeners will do their civic duty and get on out there and vote.
I got my ballot. You can track it here.
Oh, yeah.
I've already, I sent it back in and it's been counted. So I'm good to go.
Sweet.